Well, good morning, and welcome back to the second day of our conference. We're very pleased to have another distinguished panel here, and I know we'll keep having great discussions that we started yesterday. Just a reminder, we are filming this. We're live stream on the web, so for all of our fans that are out there watching this on computer. So please silence your cell phones. And then following this panel, we will have lunch, as we did yesterday, downstairs. And so I will turn it over to Sir David.
Thank you, David. If I can add my good morning and welcome. I was reflecting overnight on yesterday's session and thinking about today, and three thoughts crossed my mind. Firstly, I think we were very fortunate indeed with an analysis that was truly exceptional yesterday. I think the clarity, the subtlety, the sophistication and the relevance were distinctly unusual. So I felt privileged to listen to that yesterday. What was striking, and then my second point, is the distinction between what was set before us, I think, yesterday, and the conventional narrative, particularly that at a political level in London and Washington. And I think that's interesting. And above all, I think, a sense of privilege and luck of being part of these wonderful institutions, of Georgetown and St Andrews. How many other people are benefiting from the insights that we're receiving? And they, I think, illuminate the distinction between the various analyses and hopefully contribute to a more useful debate in the wider public interest. I was particularly seized, if I might say so, Bruce, by your 10-point action plan, which I think is really excellent, which you set out, I think it was almost in your last slide, and assisted by the great Georgetown team. And I really hope that this conference can assist to support wider international deliberation on those excellent points. And I think any ideas that we have to promulgate that, I think, would be, and support it, would be extremely valuable. And particularly if we can add both sides of the Atlantic to that debate. And our good luck yesterday continues today, until the weekend, ladies and gentlemen. Our theme this morning is intelligence and counterterrorism, which covers pretty well everything. And our three outstanding speakers are with us this morning. We've got two distinguished Georgetown scholars, Elizabeth Arsenault and Truls Tonnessen. They will be speaking on the perils of torture and on terrorist propaganda. And in the middle, a doyen and a legend of the US intelligence community, John McLaughlin. I say that, John, because at our age it's comforting to know that we're both alive. And the order will be Elizabeth, the legend, John, and Truls. So, Elizabeth, without further ado. I'm glad I'm not the legend. Yeah, whatever.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you all for attending this event this week. I speak for the Center of Security Studies when I say we are delighted. We are delighted to co-sponsor this event with CSTPV. We are so grateful for the work that everyone has done to make this possible. I don't see Andrea Clabo in here right now, but if you all get a chance before you leave, I would absolutely go up and shake her hand, give her a high five, give her a hug. She, probably more than anyone, does the most to make sure these events can happen at all. She is incredible. She is a legend, truly. So, in my opinion, just to piggyback on what Sir David said, I think forums such as these are essential. They are so necessary for us to discuss emerging issues in terrorism policy, emerging issues in terrorism scholarship. Now, if you were lucky enough to attend the sessions yesterday, you benefited from tremendous discussions, tremendous insights, and I hope to continue that today with an issue that I think exists at this intersection of intelligence and counterterrorism. And this issue that I'm going to talk about today has the potential to imperil our allied cooperation, imperil our intelligence gathering, and potentially render the United States less safe. And so what I'm going to talk about today is the use of torture as a counter-terror tool. Now, to get us all in the right frame of mind to think about torture at 10 o'clock on a Friday, I wanted to put forward two things for your consideration. I wanted to read you two passages. One is a fictional passage, and one is a non-fictional passage. Fictional passage I'm going to read to you today is from 1984 by George Orwell. If none of you have read it, I would strongly recommend once finals are done that you pick up a copy and read it. So the passage I'm going to read for you today is Winston has been captured. Winston is our protagonist. He's been captured and he's been sent to a place called Room 101. And the feature about Room 101 is that it is very individualized torture. It is what is most painful for that person to suffer. So O'Brien says to Winston, by itself, he said, pain is not always enough. There are occasions when a human being will stand out against pain, even to the point of death. But for everyone, there is something unendurable, something that cannot be contemplated. Courage and cowardice are not involved. If you're falling from a height, it is not cowardly to grasp at a rope. If you've come up from deep water, it is not cowardly to fill your lungs with air. It is merely an instinct which cannot be disobeyed. It is the same with you and rats. For you, they are unendurable. They are a form of pressure for you that you cannot withstand, even if you wanted to. You will do what is required of you. So, quick question, is that the fictional passage or the non-fiction passage? Thank you. It is the fictional passage. The non-fictional passage that I would like to read to you is drawn from what is known as the Second Bybee Memo. The Bybee Memo was issued from the Department of Justice, August 1st, 2002, and it analyzed 10 techniques that were considered to be applied to Abu Zubaydah, one of the first high-value detainees captured. And the passage says, you would like to place Zubaydah in a cramped confinement box with an insect. You have informed us that he appears to have a fear of insects. In particular, you will tell Abu Zubaydah that the insect you are placing in the box is a stinging insect. You would, however, place a harmless insect in the box. Now, was that the fiction or the non-fiction passage? That is the non-fiction passage. For those of you that read 1984 in high school or in college, this was Orwell's nightmare scenario of a government that had unfettered control. But the difference between the fiction passage and the non-fiction passage is that in the fiction passage, Big Brother does not actually put the rats on Winston's face. In the non-fiction passage, Abu Zubaydah was indeed put into a cramped confinement box with an insect because his interrogators had been told that he had a deathly fear of insects. So the reason I would like to talk about this in particular today is that observers of the 2016 presidential election, both inside the United States and outside the United States, have noted that this campaign has revived the debates around torture. And in particular, two of the remaining candidates in the Republican field, Donald Trump and Ted Cruz, have indicated their support for waterboarding as a means to interrogate suspected terrorists. From televised debates to town hall meetings to sort of routine press appearances, many of them have included these statements saying that torture is an effective counterterrorism tool, that torture is an effective means to gather intelligence. So we are going to spend the next few minutes discussing this policy. This conference is about the future of terrorism. So we're going to talk about what this future policy might mean. What might it mean for the United States? What might it mean for its allies? So to begin with, to talk about the future, we of course have to go back to the past. So we're going to take a step backwards and talk about the climate in the United States after the 9/11 attacks. And the immediate answer to the question of why the United States tortured is a surprisingly simple one. No one who could end the program, no one who could amend the guidance, no one who could overturn the decisions said no. And at the time, individuals inside and outside of the government thought that the United States was imminently going to be attacked again. People were trying to do what they thought was right. But in this climate of fear, in this climate of vulnerability following the 9/11 attacks, the administration of George W. Bush authorized the CIA and the Department of Defense to use a range of extraordinary tactics. Many of them were developed and adapted from Chinese methods used during the Korean War. And these tactics, the purpose of them was to extract information from the captured detainees. And as I read before, these tactics were almost Orwellian in their creativity, in their cruelty. and they defied all legal and normative prohibitions in U.S. and in international law. We now know that in the name of national security, detainees were waterboarded. They were subject to sleep deprivation of up to 180 hours. They were subject to stress positions. They were subject to ice water baths, among many other techniques. For the first time in the history of the Geneva Conventions, the United States used law to take away rights rather than to expand human rights. Now, to put this into perspective about the relationship between the United States and the Geneva Conventions, and the relationship between the United States and international humanitarian law, the customs and standards for handling POWs, the norms around POW treatment, are a uniquely American norm. These customs and ideas were standardized, were accepted long before the United States even became a sovereign state. This customary law found its place in Continental Army military doctrine, in the thinking of leaders such as George Washington, who wanted to, no offense friends, send a message that the United States was different than Britain, that the United States wouldn't routinely just hang, just torture those in its captivity. So at the Battle of Trenton, when the United States surprised the Hessians, George Washington issued the order that they were to be treated with humanity. So it starts in the Revolutionary War. During the Civil War, the North developed a code of conduct called the Lieber Code. It was the first attempt by a modern state. It was the first attempt by a modern state to issue limitations on what soldiers could do in a war. The United States has consequently participated in every international conference examining human rights, examining humanitarian law. And even during the Vietnam War, faced with an opponent not unlike al-Qaeda, not unlike the Taliban, due to concerns over U.S. prisoners, due to concerns as to how the North Vietnamese and the Viet Cong were treating U.S. soldiers, the U.S. military and government created an expanded set of rights for the captured members of the Viet Cong during the Vietnam War. So my point in giving you this history lesson is to say these practices, these ideas that those in U.S. captivity are treated humanely, has constituted aspects of U.S. identity since before even the Revolutionary War. However, what we saw over the course of the 1990s was the falling prestige of international law in the United States. There was a pivotal role played by the Kosovo conflict in separating the United States from the UN Charter and in separating the United States from international law in general. And this belief about the weakness of international law, about the impotence of international law, would take on much strength and energy during the Bush years. The bottom line is that the United States once embraced the Geneva Conventions across a range of actors, across a variety of spaces, and in contradistinction to our enemies. And 9/11 changed that. And it changed that in a way that threatens to erase from memory that earlier practice. So for the policymakers of the Bush administration, 9/11 became this inflection point. It became this paradigm-changing event about how we think about U.S. detention practice. So, as is well known now, after public revelation of the practices, Congress banned procedures like waterboarding in 2005. President Obama issued an executive order in 2009 to restrict all government employees, including CIA agents, to use only the techniques specified in the Army Field Manual. And in June of 2015, quite recently, a torture ban was passed in the Senate. And yet, one strange aspect of this current political climate that we are living in is that the Republican candidates appear to be competing in their embrace of torture. Well, Senator Cruz has argued that torture is wrong. He has simultaneously defended waterboarding as an enhanced interrogation technique. In New Hampshire, Cruz stated, "Torture is excruciating pain. Torture is excruciating pain that is equivalent to losing organs, losing systems." When asked then, as a follow-up question as to whether or not waterboarding was torture, he said it is not. It is enhanced interrogation. It is vigorous interrogation, but it does not meet the definition of torture. Donald Trump, as was discussed yesterday, Donald Trump has made even more egregious claims with regards to these techniques. He has said that he would go beyond. He would go beyond the enhanced interrogation techniques that were proved in the early years of the Bush administration. In a town hall meeting recently, he said, the problem is that we have the Geneva Conventions. We have these rules, we have these regulations so that soldiers are afraid to fight. He said, we, the United States, can't waterboard, but ISIL can chop off heads. And he finished by saying, I think we've got to make some changes. I think we've got to make some adjustments. And then during the presidential debate in Detroit, Mr. Trump made the statement again that we needed to do things that were a hell of a lot worse than waterboarding. And he also said that he would authorize the military to kill family members of terrorists. This was added to his statement from last November that waterboarding would serve nicely as a punishment even if it failed to loosen terror suspects' lips. He said if it doesn't work, they deserve it for what they do to us. This is consistent with the view that he stated right after the terror attacks in November. The Belgian authorities should have tortured the suspected terrorists they captured days earlier. So what does this all mean? Trump has made open promises to commit war crimes. It is not possible to employ interrogation procedures that are a hell of a lot worse than waterboarding without committing war crimes. Nor is it possible to target terrorist families without committing war crimes. So ordering the military to kill the family members of terrorists falls under that definition of collective punishment that is outlawed by the laws of war. In addition, it would be a violation of the Geneva Convention, as I mentioned above, that the United States was instrumental in promulgating. The Geneva Convention was revised in 1949 following the horrors of prisoner treatment in World War II. And the purpose of the Geneva Convention is not to eliminate warfare, it's not to eliminate fighting, but to mitigate suffering. And to put it in context, the Geneva Convention is the rare international treaty that, with the adherence of South Sudan in 2012, has a universal acceptance. In addition to that, it would violate the Convention Against Torture, which the United States is bound. It was signed into law by President Reagan in 1988, and it says no exceptional circumstances whatsoever. No exceptional circumstances whatsoever. Whether a state of war, whether a threat of war, internal political stability, or any other public emergency can justify the use of torture. So those are the international laws, to say nothing of the domestic laws that outlaw these types of practices. Laws like the Federal War Crimes Act, the Torture Victims Act, and the Uniform Code of Military Justice. So what have leaders said in response to these statements? So John Brennan, director of the CIA, said in response that the CIA would not waterboard. And then what did Donald Trump respond to him? He said that claim is ridiculous. It is ridiculous that the United States, rather than being weak, needs to match the ruthlessness of its enemies. Now, despite the statements of John Brennan and also the statements of Michael Hayden came out and said that the claim to kill terrorist families was among the most troubling of the campaign statements. People are clapping. Americans are applauding. In my view, the most troubling aspect of these statements is not the statements themselves, but the public response to them. During the debate in which Cruz said that he would not use waterboarding in widespread use, people booed that statement. Similarly, when Donald Trump said in South Carolina statements about doing a hell of a lot worse and I'd go stronger, what was the response? Cheers, applause, hoots. Now, shouts in favor of torture certainly exist at one end of the spectrum. But a nationwide poll in December of 2014, the week that the Senate intelligence report was released that examined U.S. detention practices, found that more than half of all Americans surveyed believe that torture can be, often or sometimes, justified. So let's talk about what using torture as a counterterrorism tool actually does. There was a Senate Armed Services report released in 2008 that found that the U.S. detention policy damaged our ability to collect actionable intelligence, that the U.S. detention policy strengthened the hand of our enemy and ultimately compromised U.S. moral authority. What do these practices do legally? Legally, they diminish the ability of the United States to be a credible advocate for human rights around the globe. Legally, they called into doubt the question, the role of law in U.S. society. And they undermine the reputation of the government domestically, thereby eroding public support for the war. What do these practices do with regards to foreign policy? With regards to foreign policy, they ruined the careers of some allied politicians. They negatively affected the U.S. relationship with allied governments. And they led to a severe deterioration in the U.S. reputation abroad. And so how about operationally? On the operational side, there were some foreign intelligence agencies that refused to share information about the location of suspected terrorists for fear of becoming implicated in eventual torture plots. In addition, one concern is that the legacy of torture may make it harder for the U.S. military to compel enemies to surrender on the battlefield, since some individuals may rather choose to die fighting than surrender to the United States to be exposed to cruel treatment for an undetermined amount of time. Proof that the legacy of torture still haunts the United States can be found in the execution of the U.S. and foreign hostages by the members of ISIL. Hostages, such as the U.S. journalist James Foley, were purposely dressed in orange jumpsuits, purposely dressed to draw a line between the treatment of captives at Guantanamo Bay and his execution. These legal, these operational, these foreign policy harms call into question the narrative of some that the United States is better off keeping torture as a counterterror tool. So some have argued there were no harms. Some have argued that using enhanced interrogation had tremendous benefits for the United States government and for the war operation. Those individuals would point to facts such as that torture and enhanced interrogation helped compel the capture of high-value targets like Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, or helped us locate and eventually kill Osama bin Laden. But the question I would ask, and I hope that we could discuss some during the time that we have left, is, but at what cost? At what cost? Recently, Director Brennan was asked in an interview about what he thought the value of the enhanced interrogation program was. Could we have gotten that same information about Khalid Sheikh Mohammed's whereabouts, about where Osama bin Laden was, without using coercive techniques? And his answer was that it was unknowable. It was impossible to ascertain whether or not these coercive techniques did, in fact, produce better results than non-coercive techniques. But where I would like to conclude my thoughts is this idea that respect for the role of law, respect for the Geneva Conventions, does not place the United States at a disadvantage in our shared struggle against violent extremism. And I also think, as uncomfortable as it is, we need to talk about torture. We need to talk about what the United States did. We need to have open discussions in forums such as these to dispel the idea that it is legal, to dispel the idea that it is effective, to dispel the idea that it is in any way consistent with U.S. identity. Claiming that torture is an effective counterterrorism tool, playing the torture card for political points, it is going to leave the U.S. public questioning whether or not, in the future of the U.S. struggle against terrorism, we should use these practices again. Using torture as a CT tool to gather intelligence, in my view, represents nothing less than a strategic, a moral catastrophe for the United States. And the future of terrorism should not include the unpersoning of captives who are in U.S. policy, U.S. captivity. Thank you.
Well done. Thank you very much indeed, Elizabeth. We'll follow the practice of yesterday, if that's agreeable, ladies and gentlemen, and take the questions when we've heard all of the three contributions. John, if it's convenient.
Shall I speak from up here?
Whatever's convenient to you.
All right, good.
Yeah.
Well, thank you very much, and I must say it's a pleasure to be introduced as a legend. And I appreciate the short introduction, just encapsulating it in the word legend. I speak around the country from time to time, and I was down in Mobile, Alabama, and the person introducing me went on and on and on, read my entire bio, took about 15 minutes, and I was only supposed to talk about 5. And at the end of it, he had grown so excited that he threw his arms out and said, "Now, ladies and gentlemen, let me present a man with a truly extinguished career." So, there you go. It happens. Well, when Bruce contacted me and said this was a panel about terrorism and intelligence, I thought what I would try and do is talk about the rather unique challenges that terrorism presents for intelligence, because it's very different as an intelligence subject than just about everything else I've ever worked on. And in the course of my remarks, I'll make some brief remarks on the points just made. I wasn't aware we were going to have a discussion of the enhanced interrogation program, but I'm happy to engage on that as well, and there's a place in my remarks where it kind of fits a little bit. So let's talk about the unique qualities of terrorism for intelligence. And I'm going to give you about 6, okay? And the first one is, now I've worked on political analysis, assessment of missiles. I've worked on, the early part of my career, communism in Southern Europe, Eastern Europe, former Soviet Union, Middle East, North Korea, done a lot of things. But in the last, I'd say 7 years that I was at CIA, it was almost exclusively on terrorism. And what I observed about it, first point, is that terrorism is probably the most labor-intensive thing that you can do in intelligence. It's very akin to police work, in the sense that you have to have a strategic view, but at the same time, you're into all of the details in what the police might call gumshoe work. That is, you've got to know sources, you've got to know little details, you've got to look for very small things, not for very large things, as we often did in looking at missiles and nuclear programs and so forth. When 9/11 occurred, we had only about 300 people in what you know as, I'm sure you've heard of the CIA Counterterrorism Center. And subsequent to 9/11, I always described our situation then as about 300 people spread-eagled across a dike. In other words, we could imagine, we knew that terrorism was becoming a bigger problem. If you look at the 9/11 Commission report, there's a chapter called "The Lights Are Blinking Red" or something like that, and that was quoting Georgetown saying that in the summer before 9/11. So we had a large volume of reporting that indicated the United States was going to be attacked, but we could never figure out precisely where or when or by what method. So lights were blinking red. 300 people. We could not get more resources for terrorism. In the 5 years before 9/11, the oversight committees in Congress held not one hearing on counterterrorism, despite the fact that we were speaking publicly about it in the annual threat assessment and so forth. So after 9/11, within a matter of months, that 300 people grew to 2,000 because we realized, as I say, 300 people spread across a dike. We could not do the kind of labor-intensive work you had to do in order to get on top of this problem, because at that moment in time, CIA felt uniquely responsible, I want to emphasize that, uniquely responsible for preventing another attack on the United States. Even the 9/11 Commission report, while being critical of CIA, I would say mildly critical, acknowledges that no other agency in Washington had focused on terrorism to the extent that CIA had before 9/11. So that's the first thing. The second thing I would say that is unique about terrorism as compared to other intelligence issues is that it has enormous potential for surprise. Now, you can be surprised by everything. You can be surprised in 1968 when the Soviets invade Czechoslovakia. You can be surprised when North Korea launches a Taepodong-1 missile in 1998. You can be surprised by a lot of things in intelligence. And before I list too many failures, I want to say I have a long list of successes too, but I'll talk about those if you wish. But the failures are what people notice. Well, in terrorism, the potential for surprise is much greater because you're dealing with an enemy that employs stealth, that employs communication security, that operates with no particular rules, and that is willing to die. So very different from all other intelligence issues in terms of surprise. Your best defense in terrorism, again an intelligence characteristic, very much like counterintelligence being that part of the discipline where you're seeking to detect and prevent penetrations of your service by other intelligence services. That's going on all the time in the spy game. We call that counterintelligence. And in both counterintelligence and terrorism, your best defense is offense. You have to be on the offense all the time. Third characteristic, nothing is static on terrorism. You know, on some other issues, say you're studying the missile programs of various countries, you follow the development of that program, it reaches a zenith. 9 times out of 10, you're good enough to know they're going to launch that missile, and then you collect the telemetry on it, and that's SIGINT, signals intelligence, that's encrypted, and then you break that out, and then you pause. You wait for you then study, well, what's the next thing they're going to do? And you have this interregnum where you can kind of get your act together and prepare and collect and do assessments. In terrorism, it never stops. So we had a phrase that we always used, you never take your pack off, meaning the packs you have right there. It's as though you're on expedition all the time. You never take your pack off. A fourth characteristic, and this is one that particularly, the Dean of Terrorism Studies, Bruce Hoffman, and many others, this is one that everyone knows and we all say, but it's just worth mentioning as an aspect of terrorism that's so unique, is that in this field, the enemy adapts, it does not surrender. So often when you attack terrorists, when you think you have scored a big victory, as the cliche goes, there's no surrender ceremony on a warship, they adapt, they change, like an amoeba. And so they figure out, you've done this, we need to adjust by doing this. You're bombing us, take ISIS, you're bombing us in when we began the air campaign, they quickly adjusted to start putting their material and their people closer to civilian targets, to tighten up their communications, to adapt in order to make it harder for air power to work. So everyone adapts rather than surrender. And fifth, unlike other let me say this. In intelligence struggles, the holy grail has always been detecting the intentions of your enemy. If you were to look at what we call the hard targets, it's a phrase that people use about really difficult countries to understand, opaque countries, if you will. A country like North Korea or Russia or Iran, difficult countries that are, to a degree, one degree or another, have aspects of authoritarianism. The holy grail, the hardest thing, is always to understand leadership intentions. Pretty good at capabilities. In other words, if you looked at the history of our work on the Soviet Union, we were not very good at understanding Soviet capabilities in the 1950s, but when we and the Air Force jointly invented imagery from space, photographs you could take from space, which is nothing new to your generation because you've got Google Earth on your phones. But back in the late 50s or early 60s, when someone said, hey, what if we could take photographs from space? That was a big deal. That was a paradigm shift in the collection of intelligence because for a long time we were the only ones who could do that. So we could have satellites circling the Earth and photographing Soviet military installations and forces. And for a long time, that was unique. And here's my point. Once we had that, we were never again really surprised by Soviet military capabilities. They surprised us from time to time with what they did with it. But in terms of what they had, we never really struggled to understand that once we had that, and combined with other intelligence sources. Well, that's the Holy Grail in most intelligence issues. It's not the Holy Grail in terrorism. You pretty much know their intentions. You may not know precisely their target, but I think ISIS has made its intentions quite clear and demonstrated them with their attacks, their declaration of a caliphate, their beheadings, their attacks in Europe, inspiration of San Bernardino, and so forth. What you struggle with is the reverse of what we struggled with in the Cold War. You struggle to understand their capabilities. See the difference? So right now, I would say a debate underway, at least insofar as I engage in it, in the terrorism world, is might they be developing WMD of some sort? We've seen them use mustard gas and that sort of thing. We know they have people who have knowledge of some of those technologies. Another might be, and I know the school solution to this one, the other one might be, since they're so sophisticated in social media, might that eventually transition to a cyber capability, that is a cyber offensive capability? Might they figure out and develop the ability to use the keyboard as a weapon, just as major states do? Now, the conventional answer I get from most people is, nah, they're not that smart, they're not that good. We'll see. So there's a struggle about capabilities when it comes to terrorism that is almost unique in the range of intelligence struggles. And sixth, and I think our last presentation made this point, with terrorism you come up against legal and ethical issues in a way that they do not present themselves as forcefully with other issues. And we can talk about that a little bit. In fact, let me digress just a moment to think about the terrorism issue a bit and the torture issue. First off, I think the most important thing I can say is you will not see, I'm confident, the CIA use these techniques again for a whole variety of reasons. So when political candidates say that, it isn't just John Brennan who says we won't do that, waterboarding and other things. I think any CIA director, or for that matter, any major intelligence leader is going to say no to the use of those techniques again. And there's a variety of reasons for that. One of them is that it is now clearly disapproved, illegal, and whatever else you say about intelligence, it does try to stay on the right side of legality. And looking back at that period of time, if you have looked at the report that came out of the Senate Select Committee on the interrogation program, you probably haven't looked at two other documents, which are never mentioned in all of the media coverage of this. It was never mentioned that there was a minority report done, quite a respectable one that I think was about as clinical and non-political as you can expect in a congressional debate. And second, there was a rejoinder or rebuttal, if you will, from the CIA that was published, but these are never referred to. They are now published by the Naval Institute Press in a book called Rebuttal. So this is not to say that the Senate report was entirely wrong, but it was different than other Senate intelligence reports. Now, let me compare it, for example, to the 9/11 Commission report. When the 9/11 Commission report was written, all of us were called up, this is in 2002 to 2004, we were called up to testify in Congress, and we did. And the 9/11 Commission sent us the chapters of the report for comment. We would comment, and they would reject about half our comments and accept some of them. And they would interview us. For the Senate report on interrogation completed in 2014 and published, no one was interviewed. No CIA officers were asked to express their views or to be interviewed. And the excuse they gave for this was to say that you were under legal sanction, you were being investigated. Not true. You had 3 former directors and 2 former deputies who never had that hanging over them. And those who were under investigation by a special prosecutor, John Durham, were out from under that by 2012, 2 years before the report was published. And yet, to this day, the Senate will say, we didn't interview anyone because you were under legal sanction. Second, now compare that to the 9/11 Commission report. Second, there was no opportunity to comment before, and not only that, the report was systematically leaked chapter by chapter by chapter to press, and then it was sort of built as an almost and if you read it, it is so prosecutorial in tone as, I think, to shake the confidence of even the most stout opponents of the program. But that's... Now let me just say a few words about context at the time, because there are a lot of things that are left out of the report. First, we don't use the word torture, and people say, why? Well, because the legal opinions of the time told us it wasn't torture. And we had the White House legal counsel, we had the Justice Department, and we had our own attorneys at CIA. Now, people will say, well, wait a minute, these were Justice Department, these were Bush attorneys, so therefore something must be wrong with them. To which I say, sorry, the CIA doesn't get to pick its lawyers. The lawyers you have are the lawyers you have to turn to. So let me just mention a few things that are left out of the Senate report, which are, I think, germane. First, volume. There were about 100 people in this program over time. Only about 1/3 of them were subjected to any of these techniques, and not all of them to all of the techniques. On waterboarding, there were 3 people subjected to them, and the last one was in 2003, so very early in the program. We're talking 13 years ago. Second, a little bit about the context. People often say these things might be justifiable in a ticking time bomb scenario. Now, not everyone would say that, but some people do. And by the way, I'm disavowing whatever the Republican candidates have said about this. So, they're wrong. No one's going to do this again. So just take that on board. I can't imagine it. But here's some context to think about. And I'm going to not go on too long about that. I'll give you a few thoughts, and then I'll move on in my presentation, and we can come back to this if you wish. Context. Here's some things we knew in the aftermath of 9/11. Bin Laden had met with 2 Pakistani nuclear scientists. We knew that. We didn't know what he had discussed. We did know that they said to him, when he said he wanted nuclear weapons, they said to him, you know, the long pole in the tent is fissile material, that is nuclear explosive material like plutonium or uranium that you have to fashion into a weapon. He said to them, how do you know I don't have it? Okay, that's what we knew. In order to understand any history, you've got to go back and say, what did people know at that time, not what do we know now? Second thing we knew, we had discovered in our initial, remember we had teams into Afghanistan 15 days after 9/11. We had discovered in Kandahar an anthrax program. They had one. They were experimenting with anthrax. And at this time, most of you probably don't remember, there was an anthrax scare in the United States. There was anthrax. Subsequently, it turns out not to have been Al-Qaeda, but nonetheless, an anthrax samples were going around and harming a number of people, and people were a bit panicked about that. Third, we had certain knowledge from intelligence reporting that they were planning a second wave attack on the United States, which we subsequently confirmed through the testimony of 2 of these detainees, Khalid Sheikh Mohammed and Ridwan Issamuddin, otherwise known as Hambali, who, leaving out all the details, eventually told us that his brother, whose nickname was Gun Gun, this is all very vivid in my memory, was training 17 operatives in Karachi, chosen from Southeast Asia, in aircraft techniques for an attack on our west coast. We learned that in 2004. So 2002, though, we had, or 2001, we had the report that they were doing that. And finally, we had reports that appeared credible that there were nuclear weapons in New York City. Turns out not to have been true, but in the context of those times, we didn't know. So that was the sort of thing that drove the atmosphere, if you will, that created this program. Now, the morality and ethics of it. Actually, I'm designing this weekend a section on ethics for my intelligence course, which will have its last meeting on May 3. And I haven't done this yet, and we're not going to talk about this program as far as I know. But I've thought back on that a number of times, and one of my successors, Michael Morrell, and I have talked about this. The ethical struggle the CIA had at the time was this. We had that context I just talked about. We felt uniquely responsible for protecting the United States. Legally, we had never been given responsibility before for detaining terrorists. And so this was something that, to be quite honest, we hadn't done before, and we didn't do all that well. We made mistakes, and I'll talk about those. The ethical struggle at CIA was, we know that if this program goes forward and it becomes public knowledge, it will be controversial. On the other hand, if we succeed in capturing these people, which, by the way, were rather brilliant operations, we captured, how many high-level captives have you heard of recently? We captured the 9/11 era leadership of Al-Qaeda, about 14 of them. If we have those people, and they have information that can protect our citizens, and we don't get it, and more citizens die, how ethical is that? That was the struggle. Will we have the blood of our citizens on our hands if we fail? And we had a clear sense that the Congress would hold us responsible should that happen. In fact, I would say that between 2002 and 2008, members of Congress, first a small number and then subsequently the large membership of the two intelligence committees, was briefed on 60 occasions, and in the early days posed no objections to this program. That's a little amnesia going on there now with Congress. But in fact, one of my officers came back from one of these briefings after we had captured Khalid Sheikh Mohammed and came back a little stunned, actually, because the enthusiasm in the committee that had been briefed was such as to say, essentially, do what you have to do to get that information. So this is one reason why the CIA will not do this again, because it was asked to do this, it had approval, and subsequently that approval was withdrawn, and it was not only censored but excoriated for having done it. This will not happen again, because one of the lessons you learn is don't do controversial things that are subsequently going to be disavowed by the political masters who point you in that direction. Is that a good thing or a bad thing for the country? Do you want an agency that, as Mike Hayden always says, is willing to get chalk on its cleats? Or do you not? So that's a struggle that I think you will see play out in CIA over the coming years. Also, I would say, not every technique was used on every individual. The first thing you did was to try relation building. That often worked. If it didn't, the idea of creating physical and psychological pressure, but not. The other thing that people don't understand is the impression everyone has is that people would be tortured and then they would give you information. No. The attempt in this program was to create a sense of isolation and helplessness in these very small number of captives who were not battlefield, low-level battlefield captives. These were the senior hardcore leadership of Al-Qaeda. And remember, Khalid Sheikh Mohammed had beheaded Danny Pearl, a Wall Street Journal reporter, long before 9/11, long before any of this had happened. So that's the kind of person we were dealing with here. Mistakes were made. I'm going to stop here and then we can come back to it if you wish. Mistakes were made. Also not mentioned in the Senate report, I should say Senate Majority Report, is that there were 30 accountability proceedings held for officers who exceeded the guidelines provided, and 16 people were sanctioned. One was fired in my office. And so that's an important part of this you need to know. This is not a perfect program, but the agency did its best to police it itself. So all that said, I don't deny it was a controversial program. I don't have any reason to think it will ever happen again. And I'm going to leave it at that now, but we can come back to it if you wish. So with that, let's look at that as a foundation. Remember, I've mentioned 6 things that are different about terrorism when it comes to intelligence. Let me just say a few things about how intelligence has engaged with terrorism in 3 eras. Cold War era, the era of 9/11, and post 9/11. Okay, Cold War, I didn't do a lot of work on terrorism, to tell you the truth. I was working on other things. But I remember my colleagues were quite spun up a number of times about terrorist events, and most of them are familiar moments in history, but they're different than the 9/11 era. I had to engage episodically, but I wouldn't say intensively. And sometimes our engagement on terrorism was through the optic of our Soviet obsession during the Cold War. So you all know the names of groups like Abu Nidal. You all know people like Carlos Jackal. I remember attacks like the La Belle discotheque attack, for which Ronald Reagan retaliated on Libya, the Pan Am 103 attack, subsequently known to be caused by Libya, and so forth. There were also in the Cold War, you know, many other attacks, but there were also groups that were primarily country-oriented, and I worked on only one of them, a Red Army faction in Germany I did not work on. The Shining Path in Peru, I did not work on. The Red Brigades in Italy was actually the first contact I had, or first opportunity to work on a terrorist group, because I was, at that point in my career, working on communism in Southern Europe. That was a vicious group. Blowing up railroad stations, kidnapping people, including an Italian prime minister, Aldo Moro, a very respected Christian Democratic politician, held him for weeks and subsequently killed him and left him in the trunk of a car, which left a gaping hole in the Italian political situation at a moment when, for the first time in post-war history, the communists and Christian Democrats were beginning to reconcile, and Aldo Moro had been the vessel for that. And perhaps the reason that this group had kidnapped him and killed him. But they are pretty much history now. Now, the important thing about these events and these groups is they were not global. They were not global. Today we're dealing, of course, with a global phenomenon. And in the period after when the Cold War ends, 1991, the Soviet flag comes down, okay? Soviet Union is history. We enter a new era. And that period of the 90s is one, before 9/11, when terrorism moves steadily up the list of priorities, displacing our obsession with the Soviet Union. And the key events, of course, were 1993, the attack on the Trade Center, 1996, the year that the CIA becomes so aware of bin Laden, 1996, that we form a special unit to follow bin Laden, the bin Laden unit, called it Alex Station, naming it after the son of one of the officers in the group. 1998, the embassy attacks in Africa, Tanzania and Kenya. 2000, the attack on the USS Cole warship in Yemen, and then, of course, 9/11. So it's moving steadily up as an issue of priority in the intelligence world. Why? Why? Because in intelligence, how do you form your priorities? You can't do everything. You're going to make mistakes. You can't cover the whole world with equal fidelity. So the way you form your priorities is in concentric circles. So think of the inner circle as the place where you put the highest priority, and then the circles that go out from that have priority but lower priority. In that inner circle, you always put things that threaten the lives of Americans, our allies, or the physical security of the United States. Well, that used to be the Soviet Union. So it's gone. What starts to move up into that inner circle? Terrorism, because over the 90s, it became clear it was threatening the lives of our citizens. I don't know that we would have said before 9/11 the physical security of the United States, but ultimately it did, for reasons that I don't have to explain. So maybe the best way to illustrate, how are we doing time-wise? We're okay. Maybe the best way to illustrate this dramatic difference is to briefly compare the Cold War with the 9/11 era in terms of, let's say, 5 or 6 measures that have to do with intelligence. So going back to the Cold War again, we looked at everything through a kind of Soviet prism, if you will. So the only reason we were interested in Latin America or Africa primarily was because there was a potential Soviet connection, because they were infiltrating Latin America, or this was one of the motives behind the Vietnam War, mistaken as it was nonetheless the tenor of the times. You've got to get back into those times. Now, that's not true, of course. Now intelligence, largely because of terrorism, has to look at every country for what it is in and of itself, down to the municipal level, the tribal level, the regional level, languages, all of that. And that emphasizes the earlier point I made about the labor-intensive nature of intelligence, of terrorism for intelligence. Second, back in the Cold War, we had to look for, when I say look for, I mean as intelligence officers, discover in the world and illuminate very big things. Deployed Soviet nuclear forces. Well, if you were lucky, you could see the bases from space. Bombers, submarines, a motorized rifle division on the German border. Big things. Okay, well, intelligence still has to keep track of those things, right? You want to know what is the Chinese nuclear capability and where is it? You still have to do that, but today you've also got to look for really little things too, with equal fidelity. A bomb in a suitcase, one person in a city of 17 million people, a single packet of data moving through the global information network, not even a whole message, because that's how the information moves. And they've got to assemble really little things. See how it gets harder? Secrets. Back in the Cold War, we had the luxury that secrets were in the hands of hundreds of people, and they worked in places you could see. Ministries and embassies and cabinets, and you could meet them at cocktail parties, and you could develop relationships, and you could recruit secret agents, and they could give you information from inside, and you could see their capabilities from space. Well, today, the secrets you most want might be in a remote part of Syria, deep inside Raqqa, deep inside Mosul, where we are not yet prepared to counterattack, along the Afghan-Pakistan border, in the deserts of Libya. You don't meet these people at cocktail parties. So secrets, penetrating the enemy, much harder. Maybe the biggest difference is sharing information. So back in the Cold War, we didn't have to share what we learned with very many people. A few other federal agencies, our closest partners, primarily the Commonwealth countries, Britain, Australia, New Zealand, Canada, some of our NATO partners. But today, with terrorism, as you know, we need a worldwide coalition of intelligence services and governments that have similar views. And here's the hard part. We have to share it domestically. CIA is not allowed to collect in the United States, but the FBI is, through means that we can discuss. But it also means that if some CIA officer discovers something, a nature of threat, in the back alleys of Cairo or Islamabad or Karachi or Kuala Lumpur, that has to migrate into some database that a local law enforcement official here has access to. Because if a highway patrolman in Maryland picks up a car full of suspicious people heading to Washington and can't identify them or has no intelligence on them, then it's arguably today a CIA or FBI failure. So that's a huge challenge, to share that kind of information across those domestic lines. And finally, maybe a fifth big difference is one I've mentioned already, that today the focus is so heavily on capabilities with a general understanding of what their intentions are, as opposed to during the Cold War. So, let me just say a couple words about how CIA has changed under the impact of terrorism. Speaking mainly for CIA, but in a way I'm speaking for the whole intelligence community, but my platform here was looking from the CIA perch. So, in the decade before 9/11, this is a decade that British scholar Christopher Andrew, who's a wonderful scholar of intelligence, often calls the era of uncertainty, the decade before 9/11, because it's a decade when America is looking for a peace dividend, when intelligence resources are reduced by about 23%. When 9/11, in that 1990 period, I was in charge of a unit that followed the former Soviet Union, the 15 republics that fell out of the Soviet Union when it broke up. And in the course of 3 years, I had to reduce that unit by 40%. Okay? So that's what happened in the 1990s. Well, when 9/11 happened, resources flowed back because all of a sudden the Congress said, stop this can't happen again. And resources flowed back dramatically to the intelligence community. So it is much better resourced today than it was in the 1990s. Second, the CIA, as our previous presentation indicated, and as my comments indicated as well, the CIA gained a lot of new authorities and responsibilities that it didn't have before for capture, detention, some lethal authorities, if you will. All of that changed after 9/11, presenting a very different pattern of work and responsibility for the CIA. Third, I think we now have, as opposed to the 1990s, a generation of officers who've been socialized in war. Practically every CIA officer, analyst, or operator has been in the war zones for some extended period of time. Mostly the operators, but in the analyst cadre, I would say, I don't know the figures, but I would say at least a third of our analysts have spent extended tours in the war zones. What does that mean? It's the first generation of CIA that looks a lot like the World War II generation of the Office of Strategic Services, the first major national intelligence organization the United States had. After World War II, those people came on the scene as people who'd been through mostly covert action programs in World War II under Wild Bill Donovan, General Wild Bill Donovan. Fourth, you now have a CIA that is so intimately integrated with the military. Contrast that with 1990 and the Gulf War, the first Gulf War, in which the United States successfully pushed Saddam Hussein out of Kuwait after he had invaded it. One of the complaints from the military after that war, and from General Norman Schwarzkopf in particular, the commander, was that intelligence was okay, but it never got all the way down to the commander. The connection was not intimate enough. And while one can offer a rebuttal to that, the basic point is correct, that we were not as good at supporting the military directly as we needed to be. Think about it for a minute. If you're the CIA director, your first counterpart has to be the Secretary of Defense. I mean, you have to support, you have to be a combat support agency. When your troops are in harm's way, that has to be your number one priority. Well, over the course of the dozen or so years since 9/11, it was not this way in 2001, but over the course of those 12 years, relationships have developed between the U.S. military and the intelligence community generally, not just the CIA, to the point where jointness, if you will, the phrase that people use for the military subsequent to the Goldwater-Nichols reforms, really applies to civilian intelligence and the military these days. If you visit field installations, very hard to tell the difference between civilian intelligence officers and uniformed military officers in frontline units. So the integration of capability, particularly with United States Special Operations. The most overt and impressive demonstration of that was the bin Laden takedown in 2011, which was an operation done technically under, there's two sets of authorities, Title 50, which applies to covert action, and Title 10, which applies to traditional military operations. It was technically done under Title 50 as a covert action because it was very secret and very tightly planned, and it was a covert action operation in conception. But it was actually executed under Title 10 by Special Operations Forces under the command of Admiral William McRaven. So Leon Panetta and the CIA director and Bill McRaven, the Special Ops commander, were the co-commanders of this operation, and it worked seamlessly. And there are so many lessons that come out of that, both in terms of the way the intelligence was developed to have a degree of confidence that that's where bin Laden was, and then the way that the operation subsequently unfolded. So that's one overt manifestation of it, but I can assure you that it is something now rubbed into the fabric of both the military and the CIA. I think that's a good thing. Others might argue the contrary, but I think it is a capability the United States now has that is almost unique in the world. And many military figures in particular are concerned that as we pull back from the war zones, that this will be a capability harder to sustain. So there you are. I'm not going to say a lot about post-9/11 terrorism because I think you talked a good deal about the threat yesterday. I would just say that everything I've said up till now about what makes terrorism unique for intelligence, just double it. Just double it. So take the threat itself, just in terms of numbers, okay? In my era, we were dealing with an al-Qaeda of, well, maybe hundreds. I suppose you could stretch it to thousands. Someone probably has a better estimate, but manageable numbers. Now we're dealing with literally thousands, and we're dealing with what I think arguably is the largest safe haven terrorists have had, well, since 9/11. And we always said that if you were looking for a kind of a theory for how to attack terrorists, this isn't high theory, but it's just sort of tactical thinking, really. The three things you had to do was destroy the leadership, deny it safe haven, and change the conditions that give rise to the phenomenon. So we worked mainly on the first two, destroying leadership and denying them safe haven, and did that pretty successfully with al-Qaeda, I think, although one can see the renaissance of al-Qaeda in certain aspects of their operations now. But for a time, I think they were really back on their heels. The third thing, changing the conditions, not an intelligence job. Intelligence has a role to play, but that is an all-government job. That is maybe a multinational all-government job. But point is, post 9/11, double everything I said earlier. And so it means to me that intelligence will continue to be driven by terrorism to an inordinate degree. And I'm going to stop there. I have some thoughts on why ISIS is a bit back on its heels now, but not enough to give us any comfort. So, but I'll stop there, and thank you very much.
Truls, welcome.
Okay, thanks. Thank you. Well, first of all, I want to thank Bruce and the rest of the organizers for inviting me to this very interesting conference and for arranging it. And also to my two previous panelists for very interesting presentations. And in the fight against ISIL, ISIS, or whatever you want to call them, and against Al-Qaeda and other terrorist groups, there's been much attention on the importance of confiscated internal documents produced by these groups. And yes, these documents have been very important for the purpose of intelligence and counterterrorism by helping us gain a better understanding, for instance, of their inner workings and administrative and organizational details or structure of these groups. And these documents also help us identify inner conflicts and disagreements within this organization that otherwise will be difficult to identify. And of course also their possible disagreements and relationship with other terrorist groups or organizations. And it's also fair to say that one of the most important reasons for the fall or the success in the defeat of Al-Qaeda in Iraq, ISIL's predecessor, was the dismantling of its network, partly by help of these internal documents, where the capture of a key leader by, for instance, special forces often were accompanied by the confiscation of a trove of documents, helping to identify yet other leaders of the network and thus initiating a snowball process. And luckily for us, these groups have a propensity to write down and document their internal structures and the identity of their foreign fighters and recruits, for instance, even though they know that these documents eventually may fall in the hands of their enemies. They can either be provided by defectors from the group, like we recently saw from the Islamic State in Iraq, ISIL, like the last batch of the several thousand Islamic State personnel records, or where some of the top leaders are killed. And these documents make a treasury trove both for the purpose of research and for intelligence. But in my presentation, I want to primarily focus on what you can learn from terrorist groups' own publications, or in other words, what you might refer to as propaganda. And the reason that I want to focus on this particular kind of sources is that although there's been much attention on or much emphasis on understanding the ideology of, for instance, ISIL through these documents and how to design effective counter-narrative and counter-propaganda against these groups, I will still argue that ISIL's own publications or publications from terrorist groups in general still is an untapped source. And a second reason why I want to focus on this kind of sources is that I have a long experience from compiling and analyzing these kind of sources, as I began collecting primary sources from the jihadi websites and various discussion forums back in 2003. And I also based my PhD on the rise of Al-Qaeda in Iraq, or these kind of sources. And of course, a lot of things have changed since 2003, and especially on the internet, with the rise of various social media platforms, such as Twitter and Facebook, where ISIL has been particularly effective and active. But although the infrastructure of the social media or jihadi online media has changed considerably since 2003, or especially since 2010, the actual content of the propaganda has not changed that much. But the most important reason is that the official publications present an opportunity that often is not given by the internal documents, and that is to methodologically measuring or tracking changes over time, and thus identify important trends and trajectories. But while the internal documents often presents a snippet of a larger conversation or a snapshot of some aspect of the organization at a given time and at a given location, a compilation of all the speeches given by the top leadership of the Islamic State, for instance, can help us identify important changes and developments over time. And this illustration here, that is the front cover of a compilation of all the speeches issued by the previous leadership of ISIL, back when it was called only Islamic State of Iraq, from 2006 to 2010. And to illustrate that, I want to highlight some findings and insights I have gained from the work with these publications, mainly from AQI, but also from, they're also relevant for understanding ISIL. And of course, although these sources primarily must be understood and seen as propaganda and treated as and analyzed with caution, put and analyzed together, the large amount of official publications can provide important insights, when they are, especially when they are contextualized and triangulated with other types of sources. For instance, Islamic State of Iraq, Al-Qaeda Iraq, they often publish these martyr biographies, like this here, which is from one of the founding fathers of Al-Qaeda in Iraq, named Omar Hadid, who was one of the first Iraqi recruits who joined back in 2004. And this, all this information, when they're put together, can reveal interesting, can be useful in tracing the history and the development of the group, and often reveal interesting anecdotes. So for instance, that Abu Musab al-Sarkawi, who founded Al-Qaeda in Iraq, did not often write his own speeches, but used speechwriters who wrote them for him. Or, for instance, that several of the founding fathers, of the Iraqi founding fathers of Al-Qaeda in Iraq, had background from the Iraqi armed forces and had been member of a kind of a Salafi underground current inside the Iraqi military. That is also, of course, important today to understand the relationship between the former army of Saddam Hussein and Islamic State of Iraq, ISIL. And this guy, Omar Hadid, on this here, he's one of those guys who belonged to a Salafi trend that had been involved in Islamic extremism back in the 90s in Iraq, before he then eventually joined Sarkawi in 2004. And for instance, in the terms of relationship and possibly future cooperation between ISIL or Jabhat Nusra or Nusra Front that we discussed yesterday, this source indicates that although both groups have their roots in Al-Qaeda in Iraq and also in Islamic State of Iraq, the origin seems to be stem from two different factions within these groups. While ISIL, to some extent, represent a continuation of the Iraqi factions and the Iraqi part of the organization, Jabhat Nusra, to a much larger extent, is a continuation of the foreign fighters, especially the regional fighters from Syria and Jordan. And also interesting to note that while several of the founding fathers of Jabhat Nusra knew or either had been to Afghanistan or knew several of the founding fathers, old generation of Al-Qaeda leaders, the current top leadership of ISIL has not been to Afghanistan. They have never met the old traditional Al-Qaeda leaders. They're veterans from the Iraqi conflict, and that's their background, which is a different background from many of the Jabhat Nusra leaders. And also accounts from defectors from the Islamic State for ISIL is a very important source, or opponents of of ISIL. Although some of these sources might, of course, be false or provide erroneous information in order to undermine ISIL's legitimacy. But these sources are interesting because they often forces ISIL to respond to these accusations, and thus force them to reveal information that they otherwise would not have revealed. And also, this, of course, there are some methodological problems with using these sources because you don't know their propaganda, how much truth is it in them. But at some times, at least, they can be surprisingly candid, as illustrated by these graphs. This graph is published by Islamic State of Iraq themselves back in 2007. And it actually illustrates, this is a bit difficult to see here, but this graph is activity in the Anbar province. That used to be the headquarters and the core area of Al-Qaeda Iraq's activity. And here they actually admits that they had lost this province and was kicked out of the province. And this other study here is not made by Islamic State of Iraq, but it's made by jihadi sympathizers and posted online in the internet in 2008. And this is a study of all the attacks and activity from various insurgent groups in Iraq. What is particularly noteworthy here is rapid fall. This is the Islamic State of Iraq from 2006, 2007, 2008. And what is particularly is to note how rapidly, how quickly the fall was of Al-Qaeda in Iraq. And it illustrates it's almost as dramatic as the subsequent rise of ISIL. So, of course, it's important to note that in the fight against AQI and ISIL, there are also some success stories, and that there are lessons to be learned from the previous falls of ISIL's predecessors. But at least for me, the most important insight gained from these sources was by studying them over time and changes in the rhetoric and the propaganda over time. Was to single out on the one document, even regardless of how important it is, could give a misleading picture because it should be interpreted and understood within a much larger context and textual corpus released by these groups. And by doing this, you'll be able to find some trends and something more than what the author and the group originally had intended. As we also the previous presentation talked about, two important insights is that organizations like AQI and ISIL are not static organizations, but they are in constant evolution, both in terms of size, strategy, modus operandi, target selection, and also recruitment base and leadership. Especially leadership is in particular important. For instance, whether a group is led by foreigners or by local fighters. And perhaps even more importantly, the conflict and the context these groups operate within also change considerably over time. And changes along all these parameters can have very important consequences for the behavior of the groups. And also a related insight is that the ideology, or at least the rhetoric of these groups, is more flexible and adaptive than to the circumstances than often assumed. And one of the main strengths and cause of the resilience of a group like ISIL is exactly their ability to adapt their ideology and strategy, or the long-term strategy, based on the constraints and opportunities these groups operating within, in the conflicts they are operating within. And if you look at the ideology of ISIL or AQI, they have many enemies, basically almost all who doesn't support them. But as all organizations, they of course have to prioritize which enemy represents the gravest threat, and or possible the larger potential for polarization and mobilization at a given time. And the official publications can help identify and give us a better understanding of changes and trends in the target selection and prioritizations. And for instance, the official statements from AQI reveals that although anti-Shiism has been a constant feature and a cornerstone of the ideology both of AQI and ISIL, if you look at the rhetoric of AQI, it became observably more anti-Shia as the Shia began to dominate Iraqi politics and as anti-Shia sentiments increased among the Sunni Arab community in Iraq in 2005. And specifically, there was a marked increase in AQI's use of anti-Shia terms such as Rafida and other terms after the first Shia-dominated government was established in April 2005. There are also indications that Zarqawi, the founder of Al-Qaeda Iraq, turned more anti-Shia after he came to Iraq in order to exploit the existence of anti-Shia sentiments among the Sunni Arab community, especially within the Iraqi military, especially after the coalition forces, in reality for the first time after the fall of Saddam Hussein, for the first time in modern Iraqi history, transferred the power from the Sunni Arab minority and to the Shia majority. And of course, this also indicates to what extent the propaganda from terrorist groups has to be contextualized and understood within a much larger context and a conflict. And also the statements from AQI and ISIL reveal that the target priorities have changed throughout their existence, based on the conditions they operated within. Initially, back in 2003, 2004, the coalition forces and the international community was the most important targets. Then Shia Muslims who cooperated with the coalition forces became the most important targets, and then later Shia Muslims in general. But after the establishment of the Islamic State of Iraq in 2006, the main priority became to fight Sunni Arabs who had took up arms or turned against this Islamic State, or the so-called Sahwa or awakening forces. But for ISIL, the most dangerous enemy are Sunni Arabs who are opposed, or Sunnis in general, who are opposed and fight against ISIL, as these Sunni Arabs might represent a local alternative to the Islamic State, and thus undermining ISIL's claim of authority and legitimacy as the sole power in these areas. And of course, as these people are from the area, so they are very intimate and they know the terrain very good. So that thus threatens ISIL from within, and represent an almost existential threat against ISIL. And therefore, it's very important for ISIL to deter them from going against them through extreme brutality. But as the Sunni Arabs also represent the ISIL's main recruitment base, and is the community they claim to represent and fight for and protect, it could be actually pretty road for ISIL to attack fellow Sunni Muslims. And this is illustrated by the very rapid fall of AQI back in 2008. And also that a large portion of the statements, propaganda from ISIL, tries to legitimize their attacks on fellow Sunni Muslims. At the same time, although ISIL, and especially foreign fighters, at times said that the goal is to conquer the entire world, the propaganda from ISIL indicates that, in contrast with, for instance, with Bin Laden's Al-Qaeda, the main priority for ISIL, or the tradition, ideological tradition they come from, is the internal fights against other Muslims, especially Shia Muslims, but also I mentioned other Sunni Arabs or Sunni Muslims that does not support them. This may, of course, also be an effect of that these are the most proximate enemies in the areas, in the core areas of ISIL activity. And at least on the surface, or based on the propaganda from ISIL, the West seems mainly to be a target due to the intervention in this kind of internal Muslim fight. And ISIL framed their attack, for instance, in Paris and Brussels, as a retaliation for Western intervention. But, of course, as there are large Muslim communities living in Europe and the West, ISIL also want to export this internal conflict to Europe in order to mobilize the various Muslim diasporas. Or in the words of ISIL, as I say, to accomplish the extinction of what they refer to as a grey zone, which is those Muslims who have not yet decided whether to support ISIL or not, or to support the so-called caliphate. And for ISIL, it's the second order and long-term effects are the most important, like increased xenophobia in the West, suspicion and discrimination against Muslims living in the West, and to increase political influence of right-wing nationalist parties like the Front National, National Front in France, for instance. And this kind of forcing Muslims to take a stand, either against either you support Islamic State or you are against them. And of course, in the ideology of ISIL, then if you're against Islamic State, then you are not, and you are apostates and you are legitimate targets. I also want to say something about if it's possible to, predict future attacks from these statements. As ISIL and other terrorist groups, of course, do not want to discuss concrete attacks plans in their official publications. They are difficult to use them to predict a very specific attack. But they often present more general guidelines and long-term strategies and recommendations for attacks in the West, both in terms of where and suggests a modus operandi. And for ISIL, at least, it seems that there is a clear correspondence between the recommendations or call for attacks in the West, like we saw after the speech from Adnani, the spokesman of the group, when he threatened attacks in the West in October 2014. Even though these attacks may not necessarily have been coordinated or directed from the top. And it's also very noteworthy to note that France, for instance, was particularly singled out in several of the speeches and statements in the period before the Paris attacks in November last year. And it's also fairly obvious that ISIL has escalated its threats and campaign against the West following the international intervention in 2014. But at the same time, they also continues still today to insist that the best choice of action is to emigrate to the so-called caliphate and fight there in order to gradually spread this caliphate. If you're not able to do that, then the second best thing is to stage attack in the West, in the home country. But perhaps more interesting, after having studied this group almost since inception, I believe there are some parameters or trends that should be followed particularly closely in order to assess the possible future developments or behavior of ISIL. One is, of course, their state agenda and whether there are any noticeable changes in the rhetoric over time. But perhaps the most important is to study the top leadership, and especially the level immediately below the leadership, those who might replace the top leaders if they should be killed. And we have seen earlier, for instance, for Al-Qaeda Iraq, that the background and the nationality and the connections of the top leaders can have very important repercussions on a group's agenda and targeting priorities. And this is, of course, particularly worrisome if some of the many foreign fighters within the group should reach its top ranks. It's difficult to know, of course, there's been many reports of several Islamic State leaders killed, but it still seems that the very top leadership is still dominated by Iraqis. And we know that the number of foreign fighters within ISIL has increased dramatically over the last couple of years, but we do not yet know the long-term effects of this will have on the evolution of the organization. And thirdly, which areas and countries present represent opportunities for renewed activity if ISIL should lose their territorial control in Iraq and Syria? For instance, when AQI basically was defeated back in 2007, 2008, we saw that many of their foreign fighters went back to their home countries, mainly in the region, and helped establish the jihadi groups there, who later again become important for the rise of ISIL across the region. But I've argued that perhaps the most important factor for understanding the development of ISIL and its predecessor have been external influences outside of ISIL's control that has shaped the condition ISIL operated within, and that ISIL adapted to. For instance, we have seen that the group previously have returned to a terrorist modus operandi when they have lost territorial control. Therefore, it's of course a danger that when it would escalate this terrorist campaign against the West, if and when it loses its territorial control in Iraq and Syria, partly as a kind of to retaliate and a kind of revenge, but also because they have no longer territorial control. And therefore, although the sources from ISIL, both the internal and official sources, provides an important insights into these groups, there is a danger that a too narrow focus on these documents without contextualizing them risk exaggerating ISIL's ability to shape its own destiny and to kind of exaggerate its agency and thus almost giving support to their narrative and thus inadvertently increasing its propaganda appeal. And at the same time, it underestimates how important the external influences and variations in opportunities and constraints, how important these are in shaping both the behavior and the potential success of a group like ISIL. For instance, if you look back in 2009 and 2010, Islamic State of Iraq, although they were weakened, they still was executing several large and coordinated terrorist attacks, released several large propaganda and ideological material, and defending its project of an Islamic State, but seemingly without much success. But when the conflicts in Syria and Iraq, two conflicts that ISIL initially only played a minor role, if any at all, within, resulted in state collapse and a power vacuum and fragmentation of authority in the contiguous Sunni Arab-dominated areas of Iraq and Syria, which also is the traditional core areas of ISIL and its predecessors. It was then ISIL began to come back. So that's one of the most important reasons for the resurgence of ISIL is not necessarily the grand strategy, although that is important, but that is one of the strongest and most organized actors in an otherwise highly chaotic environment of weak and uncoordinated and fragmented actors. And lastly, also to pay too much attention to the propaganda and strategical text produced by ISIL or the similar groups, risk overlooking that one of the primary strengths of ISIL is its ability to adapt and to improvise their long-term strategy based upon the opportunities presented on the current and condition and situation. If you look, for instance, if you search for today, this word Dabiq, this Syrian village, which is has a role in the Islamic apocalyptic rhetoric, and ISIL uses it very lot in the rhetoric today, and also the name of the English propaganda magazine. But if you search in the statements from ISIL or AQI, from the top leadership at least, you realize that Dabiq rarely was mentioned by these top leaders until they actually had the opportunity to conquer the village. And this does not imply that this belief of a coming apocalypse is important for the top leadership, but at least it illustrates and demonstrates how the change in emphasis different aspects of the ideology based on the actual conditions on the ground, partly for the purpose of recruitment. Well, I think it went dark here. But lastly, I want just to... I want to promote a new online database created by my home institution, the Norwegian Defense Research Establishment and the University of Oslo. And it's called the Jihadi Document Repository. And this contains much of a large collection of jihadi primary sources that me and my colleagues have gathered back since 1999. And here's an example from some of the jihadi journals from the Gulf, mainly from Al-Qaeda and the Arabian Peninsula. And this is not yet online. It's hopefully be released in June this year. And it is free, but of course the access is limited because we don't want this to be shared by everyone. So for people who are doing research, or for journalists, or people in security intelligence agencies, can be given access if they after applied. So if anyone is interested in this, just talk with me after the speech, or but it still is not online. Hopefully it will be in June. And this should be searchable, so you can have all the documents and search them. Mainly it's in Arabic. There are of course some also English documents, so it could be a very nice way to spread all the material we gathered throughout the years. So yeah, thank you. Thank you for your attention.
Good. Well, we've been blessed with 3 outstanding presentations. And ladies and gentlemen, your questions, your comments. Bruce.
Thank you. This was a tremendous panel, so thank you to all 3 participants, and especially Truls. It's really magnificent. It left me, though, especially Liz and John's presentations, which were both brilliant, but both left me very disquieted. So I'm curious from both your perspectives, because I want to zero in on the torture and enhanced interrogation issue. I mean, John made a very good point about the context of 9/11. And in fact, if anything, John, I think you underplayed it, because Al-Qaeda had more than one anthrax program. They were developing chemical weapons as well, in addition to their biological and nuclear research. They had highly compartmentalized parallel programs competing with one another. I don't think we've seen the last of terrorism in WMD, although with the demise of Al-Qaeda, this seems to have, and our obsession with ISIS, this seems to have fallen off the table right now. So we're not really paying attention to this. But, you know, as I started to say yesterday, when terrorists have access to sanctuary and safe haven, I think they become the most dangerous because they have the opportunities for research and development. So what are we going to do in the future when we're presented, especially given the information revolution, the exchange of technology? There's now a brilliant book out on the engineers of jihad that, at least when I started studying terrorism 30 years ago, most terrorists were teachers or medical doctors. Now many of them are engineers or scientists. So on the one hand, Liz, in addition to the moral opprobrium, but what's very clear is that we waterboarded Khalid Sheikh Mohammed 183 times. It doesn't work. But on the other hand, what are we going to do when we're confronted by the sorts of information that John described, that certainly alluded to, but we didn't have a concrete understanding, of threats that really eclipse the kinds of things we've been dealing with now? So if torture doesn't work, and John, as you point out, that no matter what any presidential candidate says, we're never going to use it, but how are we going to come to grips with what might be even greater terrorism problems in the future than we've seen today?
Do you want to start, Elizabeth, and I'll turn to John?
Sure, unless you want to start.
Go ahead. I'm happy. No, should I? Well, I'm happy to start, but let's go with Elizabeth.
I mean, I think, but Bruce, that's the question, right? The question is, so what do we do next? So to piggyback on something that John had said earlier, and to put this all into perspective, the individuals, both in the CIA and the Department of Defense, who conducted these activities were absolutely working within the law. You know, none of this were done by rogue actors. This was 100% sanctioned from the top down. So I think it's a two-part question. It's both what do we do next, and what do we do next that is both in keeping with U.S. laws, international laws, U.S. identity, U.S. customs. And I think the problem is we're faced with this situation, just as John said, where to not get information is the impossibility. To not get information on WMD, on the possibility of an attack. But the ticking time bomb scenario is a false, it's a false scenario to put forward. And the question of, you know, does torture ever work is not the right question. The question is, what do we do next that is in keeping with laws and is in keeping with US practice? So in several interviews that have now come out, many of the FBI interrogators who were there at Guantanamo Bay, who were involved in the program, who said that they had the opportunity to interview Abu Zubaydah first before coercive techniques were used, said Abu Zubaydah, who by all accounts was a very difficult individual to interrogate, they said he was responding to rapport building scenarios. He was responding to relationship building, and it simply just took more time. But to John's point, policymakers didn't want to have that time. You know, Abu Zubaydah was the first high-value target who was captured, and there was this real fear of needing information next. So what do we do next? I think at the most basic level, we can't use coercive techniques in the future. They've proven to give information. Some of it is true, but most of it is faulty. So what do we do next? We go back to the techniques that have worked historically before, techniques that have been used by NCIS, techniques that are used by the FBI, that take a lot of time. And I think the problem is those techniques, to John's point, are going to run up against national security imperatives in the future.
John?
Well, what a complicated question and issue. And let me say, I respect Elizabeth's point of view here, and it's important to have this debate. One of the, excuse me, one of the ways in which I fault the Senate report is that it, and if you read now, some scholars are starting to figure out what's wrong with it. Read Bob Jervis's review of the Senate report in the Foreign Affairs magazine, and he concludes by saying, or somewhere in his, the theme of his report is it was a missed opportunity because it did not stimulate this debate. It, among other things, by not interviewing any, if they had interviewed CIA officers, they would have had to come up against some of the issues you've just raised, and they would have had to put, the issue would have been less black and white and would have been grayer, which is where it needs to be in order to really have a debate. Who was it? William Bundy said the color of truth is gray. So, first off, this whole debate becomes more complicated if you accept or conclude that these techniques were effective. Now here, Elizabeth and I may disagree. Regrettably, for the debate, I think they were effective. And 1/3 of the footnotes in the 9/11 Commission report are based on information from these interrogations. So I can give you, you can look up what I've written about this in several places. But if I were to pick out a couple instances, well, let's start with Abu Zubaydah. It's true that FBI officers were interrogating him at the same time. What is often left out is that during their interrogations of him, he was subjected to intense sleep deprivation, this was before there was a CIA program. At that point, sleep deprivation was seen as a legitimate and lawful and appropriate technique to use in standard interrogations, having nothing to, this is before the program even was invented. So he was not, there was more than relationship building going on here. And sleep deprivation turns out to be one of the most effective things you can do. By the way, drugs don't work. You know, people looked into all of this. You don't inject someone with a truth serum. That's all fantasy. Sleep deprivation is a technique that is not permanently harmful in any way, which actually does make people, make it harder for them to resist telling you what they know. In any event, he was subjected to that. If I were to say that the ways in which the techniques were effective, and I've cited in writing about 7 or 8 methods, and in the CIA rebuttal to the Senate Majority Report, they take on all 20 cases where the committee says the techniques were not effective. And both Bob Jervis and, more interestingly, David Cole, a Georgetown legal professor, have both written articles having read both of those documents saying, you know, the Senate Majority Report doesn't make its case very soundly. Because if you look at the bin Laden takedown, for example, it's true, the Senate report says, well, first, the key thing was identifying, one of the key things. First, that was the result of 12 years of aggregated intelligence. But pivotal toward the end was what we were learning from detainees. And pivotal in all of that was the identification of the courier who had been servicing bin Laden, al-Kuwaiti. The Senate report says, but you heard about him earlier. His name was not unknown to you. What the detainees did was say, yeah, you've got a lot of lists of people who knew bin Laden in Afghanistan, but this guy was more important. So it focused the CIA on al-Kuwaiti. They then did the kind of research you do in intelligence to find out who is this guy, where does he travel, what else can we know about his communications, what's his family look like. They did a targeting analysis of him. And when they figured out with some confidence that this was probably the guy who was servicing bin Laden, they went to Khalid Sheikh Mohammed and Abu Faraj al-Libi, 2 other detainees who by this time were what we call compliant. Meaning, see, that's again, they weren't being tortured. They had been put through some of these techniques 2 or 3 years before, and they had reached the point where they realized, we're stuck here. So they became almost consultants, and you would go to them and say, so what does this mean? What does that mean? Would they always tell you the truth? No. But you had learned enough that when you knew they were lying, you knew they were lying. So we went to them and said, Abu Kuwaiti, is he the guy? And they said, no. And my colleague, Michael Morrell, I was not there, but Michael says we actually overheard Khalid Sheikh Mohammed telling the other detainees, hey, don't give away al-Kuwaiti. So the fact that he lied to us was the giveaway that this was the guy. So having these people available to us as almost consultants was important. Capturing Ridwan Ismahuddin, Hambali, the architect of the Bali bombing, and al-Qaeda's main person in Southeast Asia. I could go through, but I'm going to take too much time if I start going through all these cases. But essentially, in a sentence, that was Khalid Sheikh Mohammed saying, gave some guy, Majid Khan, $50,000 to get to Hambali. Found Majid Khan, he gave the money to a guy named Zubair, who gave it to a guy named Lily. Found all these people, found Hambali in a part of Southeast Asia, helped by the local police. Gun battle ensues, he's captured. That leads to interrogation of Hambali, finding his brother, finding the people that his brother was training in Karachi who were the second wave attack. So, you see, the debate gets harder if the debate is, okay, let me use the word torture. I hate to use it. Let me just say, if the debate gets harder, let's use EITs. If you say enhanced interrogation is immoral and doesn't work, it gets harder if you say it's immoral or unethical, but sometimes it works. It gets harder. Creates a lot of cognitive dissonance that makes people uncomfortable. So that debate can go on of whether it's effective or not, because there are people who, unlike me, will say, no, it wasn't, and they have a case to be made too. Ali Soufan, for example, one of the FBI officers who was present during some of this, we disagree and reject what he says, but he says what he says. So, so there's a debate there. Now, to answer your question directly, Bruce, I think in my optic, the implication for the future is we accept more risk. In other words, there's a price to be paid, and if we want, and that's fair, this is what we could never get people to grasp. That was the CIA dilemma. We cannot do a lot of things if you're prepared to accept, can't quantify it, some more risk, maybe a little bit, maybe more. It's the same with the surveillance debate. We can have more privacy if we're willing to accept a little more risk. That makes people very uncomfortable. Now, I think what it means is, in order to avoid that situation, we have to be relentless in the offense on terrorism, keeping them under pressure so that they can't get to the point where we face that dilemma of, oh my God, they actually have anthrax. Or, oh my God, they actually have fissile material and they're going to set off a dirty bomb down on Capitol Hill. Because if we ever get to that point, I don't think we're going back to EITs, to enhanced interrogation. But there would be, I think, a debate on what do we do, and I don't think we have. Now, there's a high-level interrogation group that was formed in the wake of the rejection of enhanced interrogation. Interagency group involves FBI, CIA, Homeland Security, and I don't know what they're doing, but maybe they've figured this out. And also, I'm open to the idea, I don't know what the detainees are doing that we have picked up from ISIS. Maybe they are talking, I don't know. And I don't know what approaches are being used with them, but I hear they're talking. Maybe something is working.
Yep.
You know, it's where we have these kinds of really riveting discussions. I understand what both of you are saying, but firstly, I think the problem is we have to accept some risk, but I think as you will know from when you were in a position of responsibility as DCIA, or as Sir David would know when he was responsible for the security of London, when you're in that position of responsibility, it looks differently too.
Yeah.
That risk also, just as you said earlier, is going to be on your neck or your head.
Correct.
If there is a successful attack. I think, you know, Bret Stephens, who's not everybody's cup of tea, the Wall Street Journal columnist, had a fascinating column when the Senate Commission's report, the Senate Committee's report was released, where he said, you know, I don't care. There's nothing immoral. Khalid Sheikh Mohammed is, you know, one of the lowest human beings in the world. We know he's dead guilty, and we need this information. I mean, so that's, you know, one perspective where I think the morality is that there's always the concern, and the conceit of all torturers is that we're only torturing the guilty and the people that have the information. Of course, innocent people are swept up. But let me, and if you can, and you may not be able to answer.
I have a thought on this.
Okay. But that, and then bringing it down, and this leads to my question, bringing it away from the abstraction of WMD, let's say. Kyla Mueller, the woman who was held by ISIS, who we know was subjected to, I mean, beyond torture, the way she was treated, especially by Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi. And tangentially, I had no advice to offer because I don't do this kind of thing. Someone like you, Sir David, would have been, but an extension of her family had come to me in their desperation to try to get her out. I mean, how do you balance that? I mean, I thought to myself at the time, especially listening to this close friend of the family, I mean, this is just absolutely heartrending. And we didn't even know the full picture of the bestial treatment she received. I mean, would we not torture to free someone like Kyla Mueller if we knew someone that had access to information that would free her? Then is there a moral case to be made, especially after we know how she suffered afterwards?
This is why I think the Senate report is a missed opportunity. Because First off, on the 9/11 Commission report, though the CIA didn't agree with all of it, in the end, we accepted it, and we carried out the mandate in it. We did that with the WMD report, too. Done in the same way. I was interviewed, many people were interviewed, as the Iraq WMD report. It led to recommendations. By the way, there are no recommendations in the Senate Intelligence Committee report, none. There were recommendations in those others, and we carried them out, and to good effect. So this is why I think it was a missed opportunity. Let's assume we had had this debate, and let's assume that people came to the following conclusion, which would have been hard to come to, but is plausible to me, that what we did, much of what we did fell short of torture. Some you might put in that category, but much of what we did fell short of torture and was effective, and could imaginably be used in some future scenario to be defined. Had we been able to come out in that zone, there might be an answer to your question, but right now I think because that period, from the moment the legal memos appeared and were defined by the press as the torture memos, once the word torture was emblazoned on this whole thing, and I'm not saying it was pretty, people were not enthused about it. This isn't something people did happily. But once that was emblazoned on it, I think it's hard to go back to it once that has happened. So, that's out there. One other thought I had on that that's germane. Okay, yeah. Well, let me give you another. Let me give you another example. Here's the. I'm thinking about this sort of thing for my ethics seminar. Remember the attack by Taliban on a school in Pakistan where they massacred 150 little kids? What if you had captured a member of the Taliban 2 weeks before, and you knew through intercepted communications that they were planning to attack a school somewhere and kill little kids? What would you do? To me, that was that particular attack. You know, you would try relationship building. Now, I did that in Vietnam, and it worked. I had been trained in Vietnam. I was not in the CIA. I was in the Army. But we were talking there about young kids, 18-year-olds, not commanders like we had in Al-Qaeda. We're talking about young kids, 18 years old, who had come down the Ho Chi Minh Trail, gotten wounded, were captured, and I would be sent to a hospital to talk to them. Yeah, a cup of tea and a Camel cigarette. That's all they wanted. And they didn't want to be there. They were draftees. They hated being there as much as we did. You could immediately have a rapport. It sucks here, doesn't it? Yeah, it does. And that's different than Khalid Sheikh Mohammed. But those are the dilemmas we may face. And I say that when I say these techniques would never be used again, I say that mainly because CIA would really someone would really have to convince the CIA that this is doable and that we have your backs. It's like Mike Hayden says, you have to bring your own bucket. By the way, buckets weren't used. And by the way, 180 times is wrong for Khalid Sheikh Mohammed. He said I was waterboarded 10 times to show the Red Cross. The reason the press uses 180, this is more than you want to know. The reason the press uses 183 figure is that the count that was done very precisely, according to the legal requirement, was anytime you dribbled any water on someone, you had to count it as an action. So there were 183 dribbles over 10, I thought 5 separate events. But he said 10, so I'll accept his number.
Can I say one point?
No one ever, and the press knows that, but it may be too much for the U.S. attention span to give that distinction.
So I know that we are out of time, so if I can take 1 minute just to follow up on all of these and to respond to Bruce. I think the reason that...
and you should follow up, because this is the only time this debate's ever been held. So, so get this on tape.
I would propose for the next iteration of this conference that we focus on this topic, because I think these are the gray, uncomfortable topics that international relations is all about, and that we should have
right.
open discussions about it. And I think the primary question at the heart of the torture debate is, when barbaric things are done to you, what do you do in response, right? And I'm so glad that John brought up the point of Vietnam, because I think Vietnam is such a fascinating counterpoint to the decisions that we made now. So in Vietnam, we were under no legal obligation to give Geneva protections to the Viet Cong. The Viet Cong are not state signatories to the Geneva Conventions, just like AQ and the Taliban. They fall in this space of not being, entitled to these protections. But President Johnson, himself no humanitarian, made the decision in 1964 that he would extend Geneva protections to the Viet Cong. Even though they were not legally entitled to it, because of this idea that A, he wanted to earn reciprocal treatment for US servicemen who were captured, but B, he wanted to demonstrate that the United States was better than this, that when barbaric things were done to us, that we responded differently. And I hope that John is right. I truly, to my core, hope that these would never be considered again. But what gives me pause is that people would have said in 2000 that these techniques were unconscionable in light of 150 years of US history, in light of our engagement with the Geneva Conventions, in light of our engagement with the Convention Against Torture, in light of, at the core of the military ethos is that this is not what we do. At the core of the CIA ethos is that this is not what we do. And I think 183 times or 10 times, however many times, it's too much. We are Americans because we choose different tactics and different techniques in wartime. Now, I sincerely hope that it would never happen again, but I think the challenge is, what is undeniable about the United States in 9/11 is that we were making decisions from a place of fear and from a place of profound vulnerability. And not optimal decisions are made from that decision making. Abu Zubaydah gave a treasure trove of information. Could that information have been revealed through non-coercive techniques? It's unknowable. It is unknowable.
Okay.
Well, of course, the difference with Vietnam is that we had no direct attack on the United States. We had
Exactly.
3,000 citizens that died here. It wasn't only fear, it was a perception of danger.
Right, right.
And first off, you have to say 9/11 is unique in our history.
Exactly.
And it's different than anything else. First, well, except maybe Pearl Harbor. The only time we'd been attacked on our soil since Pearl Harbor in any significant way. So it's interesting to contemplate the election coming up because if you think about it, we've had two unusual administration experiences in a row now. George Bush was unfortunate enough to have this happen on his watch, and it affected everything that happened in foreign policy in his administration, the preemptive impulse and so forth. Barack Obama came to office pretty much committed to not be George Bush. And everything that has happened under his watch has been, his learning from that period. The next administration hopefully can find some mid-path here that takes us back to the center, normalcy, the kind of tone we had, say, during, I don't know when, George H.W. Bush was sort of a centrist. Bill Clinton was kind of a centrist. But neither of them had faced quite what George W. Bush faced and then what Barack Obama faced in the aftermath of that. So it's a unique period in the country's history.
Time for more questions? Please.
Thanks again to the panel for the wonderful conversation. I think a lot of the discussions about intelligence and ethics focuses sort of on the prism of leadership and leadership decision making. So sort of piggybacking on Bruce's questions, how should line level intelligence analysts and intelligence professionals handle these kinds of situations where maybe there's a political will to do something more aggressive that doesn't really align with the morals of the individual intelligence professionals, and perhaps is there a third way to maybe enhance whistleblowing sort of conscious objections to potential future political decision-making, political leadership, depending on whoever the next administration is, to allow the people that are actually doing the doing to say, hey, I'm going to stop this here because I've seen this before, I see where the politics is going, but I know at my level that this doesn't make sense.
John, do you want to kick off?
Yeah, I think, again, these are really tough questions. I think that, first off, it won't repeat itself in the terms that we're familiar with. This is the problem in intelligence that, and I often say to lawyers who want to be national security lawyers and they want to work in this field, fine. You're not a lawyer, are you, Elizabeth? No. Any lawyers here? Okay. But I say to them, in fact, some of my former students have gone to law school and they want to work in this field. And I say, this is frontier law. The case law is very thin. There aren't a lot of precedents. You're making the case law when you make these decisions. So, John, you and others who made their decisions, that's the first shot. They've been revised and debated. Now, there's the second shot. This will go on. So that's the first thing. Then it won't happen, next time the situation arises, it won't happen in a way that allows us to look back and say, oh, well, this is what we did then, we'll do it differently. Maybe. But your broader question is, what do you do when confronted with something that you disagree with, ethically or otherwise, and what do you do? Well, I think that the two things that you do are, first, you decide, you and your colleagues, or ethically, morally, how do we personally calculate this? And when you settle that, then you go to your lawyers and you say, legally, where are we on this? And based on those two things, believe me, the CIA has one of the biggest law firms in Washington. On the basis of those two things, you decide what you're going to do. If you really can't handle what you've been asked to do, you don't have much choice but to resign or to say no. And that happens. Most of the time, the ethical challenges in intelligence are lower level and less strategic than that. When I used to interview people to be my executive assistant, one of the things I would ask them was, tell me about an ethical challenge you had and what you did about it. And it would usually be that some supervisor had done something stupid, and the question was, would they report it? I mean, something stupid and either illegal or malfeasance of some, would they report it? And the ones I hired usually said, yes, I did. So that's about the best I can do. It comes up in analysis a lot because you're seeing a case now, and I don't know the facts of this, so I don't know who's right or wrong, but you're seeing now reports coming out of CENTCOM that the analysts there who work on Afghanistan and ISIS, I guess, are bridling under guidance they're getting from their superiors about what they can and cannot say, should and should not say. This too has echoes of Vietnam, because in Vietnam, the analysts at CIA were saying the enemy's much stronger than you think it is. They were overruled, and then the Tet Offensive occurred in 1968. So that repeats itself, and there's more of a track record on analysis where when you feel you are being politically pressured, we have outlets. We have, at CIA, we have an ombudsman who is usually a senior former person who's retired but who was widely regarded as the soul of integrity. And that person you can go to offline confidentially and say, we have a problem, and that happened. And once or twice that person would come to me and say, actually several people have come to me concerned about, and then you have the choice of taking action or not. You have the Inspector General, who is confirmed by Congress, not by you. They report first to Congress. And then you have the oversight mechanisms on the Hill, which I don't think work all that well right now. They work pretty well. That's a long story. We could spend all day on that. But it goes up and down. Sometimes it's great, sometimes it isn't. On some issues it's better than on other issues, but that's a powerful and important thing, and I support it. I mean, it's the only way you connect intelligence to the American people. So I'll leave it there.
Did you want to comment?
I think I would just add
You don't
to
have to.
sort of one structural point, right, about the balance of power between policymakers and the intelligence community. Policymakers can exist without the intelligence community, right? It wouldn't be pretty, but they could.
It'd be really ugly.
It'd be very ugly. But the intel community cannot exist without policymakers. So the balance of power fundamentally, structurally, is always going to be tilted towards policy. But I would certainly, to John's point as well about CENTCOM, point you to some of the readings, some of the scholarship by Paul Pillar, some of the scholarship by Bob Jervis, who've detailed some of the instances from the early years of the Iraq War. Truly, I believe one of the instances that Paul Pillar talks about is Dick Cheney literally driving down to Langley and standing over the shoulder of an analyst saying, this is what I would like to see. This is the outcome that I would like to see. That is truly the balance of power fundamentally skewed the wrong way.
I have to comment on that.
Yeah.
This is fun. We could go on. Elizabeth and I could go on all
We'll be here all weekend. No.
Yeah. But, you know, and Paul's a very good friend of mine, and I am a huge Paul Pillar fan. We were colleagues. I think we respect each other and like each other. I remember that a little differently. It's true that Dick Cheney would come out to CIA and he'd sit down around a table with analysts, and he would question them mercilessly, but in a polite and, I thought, professional manner. He would press them on what they knew and didn't know, and he clearly believed that what he's alleged to have believed. Let me leave it there. That's where, but you see, I think analysts have to be built to handle that, because and they did, I think for the most part, handled that well. If you disagree, you have to say you disagree. If you can't, if there are reports you're confronted with that you think are not reliable, you have to say so. I wrote a letter to Dick Cheney. It's public somewhere. It's in public somewhere, in which I said, this is as far as we can go. We cannot connect Al-Qaeda to Saddam Hussein. There's no, yes, there were terrorists in Iraq, yes, that's true, but we cannot establish an operational connection between Saddam and 9/11. But I respected Cheney for he worked very hard at understanding the reporting. We disagreed with him. And I was asked by senators sometimes, Senator Levin, I believe, why don't you hold a press conference and say you disagree? Well, that's not what you do in intelligence. You tell the person that you disagree with them, and we did that. Lots of memoirs have recounted angry phone calls and so forth and so on. But the analyst has to be built to resist that, because why? Because the issues, Bob Gates once said something, I have a lot of Bob Gates quotations in my mind, one of which is that you can tell an intelligence officer because when they smell flowers, they look for a hearse. But the other thing I remember that he said is, regrettably, the contentiousness of the issues we deal with does not always show through in the work, which means all the issues we deal with are contentious. They're really, why? What's an analyst? An analyst is someone who has an ambiguous situation, incomplete information, and constant pressure to come to conclusions. How's that? That sucks. Because you've got to come to a conclusion before you have all the data, which means you're mathematically certain to sometimes be wrong, but these are contentious issues on which there are arguments on both sides. So if an analyst isn't geared to do that argument, if an analyst has that argument with a powerful policymaker and says, I was politicized, I said, no, you weren't. You were having an argument about a contentious issue, and as long as you held your ground, you're doing what you're supposed to do. But if a policymaker confronts you with compelling evidence that says they might be right, you've got to acknowledge that too. I remember once taking some very bad news into the Situation Room and being challenged by a senior policymaker I won't name, who, as they read this, found a mistake in it. Okay? So I had to go back to my analysts and say, I didn't agree down there because there was a mistake in this. And you let me go down there with this mistake. Now, the mistake was not overwhelmingly persuasive, but it was a mistake. So here's the problem. When you're delivering bad news, you make one little error. You make one typo, you're dead. So when you're delivering bad news, you have to be holier than the Pope. I mean, you've got to be solid. Because Elizabeth is right. When you say policymakers have the pole position here, they will turn on you if you're wrong, and that's their right to do it. I mean, that's how it works.
Can I just
So,
say one
so
quick-
not being politicized means
one quick-
having the spine to resist.
Right. The last point I will say,
Moderator's nightmare.
and I would like this to be a commercial for Georgetown insofar as I think at Georgetown, part of the Jesuit identity and Jesuit mission is that we teach students to grapple with uncertainty, because there are very few jobs you're going to take out of Georgetown in which things are completely black and white. I completely agree that I think analysts should be built to resist. But my counterpoint to that would be, I can think of a 4-star general who was unable to resist Dick Cheney. And so it is a very strong order to expect.
He's not an analyst.
No, he's not an analyst. Didn't go to Georgetown. But I think it's a lot to expect a 27-year-old to be able to hold their ground against a person like Dick Cheney. And when you look at the history of the way that decisions were made in the early years of the Bush administration, the sort of axis of David Addington and Dick Cheney was overwhelming in the cabinet. But I agree. As a former analyst, I hope that we're built to resist.
The leader, this is where, you're correct, this is a 20, probably a lot of people here are 27 years old, but a young person might be intimidated by a vice president. That's why the leader has to be present to have their back. And I would like to think we were, but was everything perfect? Guess what? Probably not. But on my perspective on that whole period is that we resisted politicization, and the proof of it is on that specific issue of was Al-Qaeda behind, was Saddam behind 9/11? Commissions have demonstrated that the CIA said no and held its ground on that. You can look at the IG report from the Pentagon. So maybe it's time to stop.
One more, John, if we may, before we go to...
No, I'm happy to go on as long as you want.
John,
I mean, time for me to stop. But we can go on as long as you want.
Intriguingly, at the end of your presentation, you left hanging a splendid hook that ISIL may be going through certain difficulties or challenges at the moment. I wonder if you could share with us what was on.
Well, if you wish, I have an article. I was telling Bruce I have an article half in draft on this, and it goes like this. If I went back over what I've written about ISIS and comparing it to my experience on Al-Qaeda, I've always said that they are different from Al-Qaeda and more challenging in 5 ways. They have territory at a level that Al-Qaeda never had. Al-Qaeda rented Afghanistan for a while, but it never really governed it. It never had it. Second, they have money beyond anything Al-Qaeda could imagine. Al-Qaeda was always short of funds and begging for money. Third, they have a narrative that is much more compelling than Al-Qaeda. You saw it in the presentation from our colleague here. And finally, they have access beyond anything Al-Qaeda had because of the large number of Western passport holders. And then finally, they have social media spine to ride on as opposed to the VHS era of Al-Qaeda. Okay? So if you look at those measures, on 3 out of the, how many did I make? 5, 6? 3 out of the 5. Arguably, they're having some trouble. They've lost some territory. I don't have a reliable figure. Bruce probably has more book on this than I do, but the last figure I saw was about 20% in Syria, about 40% in Iraq. Janes collapses this to say 22% overall. Who knows? But they've lost some territory. Money, I hear, don't know, but I hear that they're having trouble paying their troops at the same level. We've literally bombed physically their supplies of money and oil facilities. So I suspect they still have a lot of money, but they may have less. Narrative, I think it sells less. There are some surveys now of the Arab population between 18 and 25 that show about 80% of that cohort does not think as highly of ISIS, doesn't find it as attractive as it once did. About 60% in the last surveys, I don't know when they were done, maybe a year ago, and sees ISIS as the source of evil in the Middle East. In those areas, they seem to be having some trouble. On access, I would say not so much, because they still have all those Western passport holders. And who knows, but I would anticipate that they're going to attack more here and in the West, Europe. And on social media, I hear there's a big New York Times, or was it Wall Street Journal or Post article quoting some of our military commanders saying that we're actually being pretty aggressive with them online. I don't know what's behind that, but it seems to me they still have outlets there by virtue of the fact that when you close off one, they can invent another one. And platforms like Telegram and others are pretty hard to get at. They're encrypted from the time the message leaves to the time it's received. So that's what I had to say. And how that nets out, I don't know. I don't know how that nets out, except that you wouldn't want to say all these things and say, relax, because they're probably still, a huge problem. And we haven't even talked about their expansion into Libya. And Bruce told me last night they were at, about 6,000 in Libya, we think. I didn't know that, but anytime I don't know something, I ask Bruce. He always knows.
Could I also quickly add to that? Just a quick comment on, because it's also important with a difference between ISIL and Al-Qaeda is also that ISIL is so much more than Al-Qaeda was. It's a terrorist group, it's an insurgency, but also kind of and it's trying to be as state builders. So it means, and there's so many people involved, foreign fighters, Iraqis, Syrians. So it's much more potential for internal fragmentation, and of course fragmentation that can be exploited. And also in concerning intelligence, we see that many defectors from the group have been very instrumental in giving information. That can be something to exploit. And also that's a weakness, but both a strength and a weakness, of course, for ISIL, that has so many dimensions. But we see between foreign fighters, between competitions and disagreements between various foreign fighters within ISIL, and between the Iraqi leadership and foreign fighters. A lot of tension, especially in long-term prospect. You can imagine tension between those who are there only willing to fight and are kind of ideologically motivated, and those who are more kind of pragmatic, if you want to call that, and to invest more in the state-building project. There has to be some tensions there that, at least in the long term.
Okay, one more, David, or you? Yeah, let's be generous. Please, your last, sir, if that's okay. The sandwiches won't get cold, David. No.
We'll give short answers.
I wanted to ask a question, and Professor McLaughlin, you kind of touched on this a little bit, so it might be a little repetitive, but I wanted to ask about specifically the role of the law and lawyers in the sort of process of setting up the EIT program. And what we know now, what we've seen from leaks and other from reports, is that we had attorneys in state and in DOJ and in CIA who didn't always agree on what was and wasn't legal. And I'm just wondering, is there a difference between saying to an attorney, is this legal, and hey, can you find a way to make this legal? Because with the law, we know that there are so many different ways to interpret it that it is very possible to make, whether you want to say it's a strong or a weak argument, but you can make an argument that almost anything is acceptable from the standpoint of the law. And I was just wondering if you could maybe talk a little bit more about, at CIA, sort of how that process worked with CIA attorneys, sort of what their role was, what they were told, and what they kind of felt their responsibility was in developing these policies from a legal standpoint.
Yeah. Well, the real authority on this and the more detailed answer can be found in a book called Company Man by John Rizzo, who was our general counsel at that time. And John was an attorney at CIA for 30 years, and not just this, but lived through every covert action program that ever existed. And he's pretty detailed on this. And because I'm not a lawyer, and because I can't give you chapter and verse, but my recall is this, that once there was a consensus that something was needed beyond what Elizabeth called, well, it's basically the Army Field Manual. Rizzo, the acting general counsel, no, it wasn't Rizzo. Rizzo was deputy general, another attorney there, whoever was the general counsel at the time, took that to the Justice Department and said, if these things were done, on what legal ground would we be? So you do not ask. We've learned through bitter experience that you do not say, find a way to do this legally, because it leads nowhere good. I can't emphasize that enough. That would be a truly stupid thing for CIA to do. So you ask, give us your legal view. And you get it. I don't recall precisely how the White House legal counsel came into this. I believe at that time it was Alberto Gonzales. But it goes through that person, and probably went through Addison as well as the legal counsel for the Vice President. Exactly what the interactions were between the Justice Department and the White House, I don't know. But the basic answer to your question is you don't go and say, find me a way to do this. Why? Because that would be wrong. But beyond that, increasingly with covert action programs, I have to say, you apply what Bill Colby once called the Washington Post test, meaning sooner or later it's probably going to leak. Now, there was a time in our country when, and it's still the case in most countries, that covert action programs remain secret. But it's very hard in our country to keep a secret about anything. So you don't want to be in the position of having asked the question the way you phrased it, because it's just going to really kill you later. So if you're at CIA, you're in touch with your lawyers all the time. See, one of the difficulties about the intelligence business is, if you think about it, you're trying to fit this arcane secret business into an open, free society, the most transparent in history. And it doesn't fit real well. Our society depends on open, free exchange of information because the citizens make the rules. So here you have intelligence, which is about compartmenting information. We're a society of laws, but intelligence doesn't ask for exceptions to the laws, but it pushes the limits. And overseas, let's face it, you're breaking the law when you're carrying out espionage in another country. You're getting someone else from another country to commit treason against their country for you. And I can justify that morally. So, again, you're fitting it into an open, free, transparent society. So you don't want to do that. I mean, you want to be very careful about your legal grounding. And I think that's only been reinforced by the controversy over the enhanced interrogation program. If it was unclear before, it's rubbed into the fabric deeply now.
Can I add on to that very, very quickly?
I suspect you would.
Well, I know. I'm very shy and retiring. So one of the important points to note is that as soon as the first individuals were captured in Afghanistan in October of 2001, the default on the ground, the boot on the ground, immediate decision was to apply the Geneva Conventions. So the military immediately said, we have captured a detainee, we are going to follow the Geneva Convention rule. And the Geneva Convention rule is if you are in doubt of someone's Geneva Convention status, you give them an Article 5 tribunal to figure out where they fall. So that was October of 2001. Several months later, John is exactly right, so Alberto Gonzales authored a memo at the request of the president in his capacity as White House counsel to essentially answer the question, what do we do, right? What do we do with these detainees? And the decision that was made at the end of February of 2002 was the idea that Al-Qaeda, in its capacity as a non-state actor, was not legally entitled to the Geneva Conventions. Afghanistan, though, was a signatory to the Geneva Conventions, and the Taliban could be seen as acting in the stead of the Afghan government, essentially forfeited their rights to Geneva rights because they failed to obey the laws of war. This was the famous memo in which Gonzales said, the new rules of war have rendered quaint the Geneva Conventions, right? It's rendered obsolete. The interaction here that's most interesting is the interaction then between the White House counsel and the Office of Legal Counsel in the DOJ. So the Office of Legal Counsel, they are the lawyers of the lawyers, right? They're the president's legal advising team. And under the leadership of Jay Bybee and John Yoo and Robert Delahunt, Delahanty, they are the individuals who author the memos at the end of August to say what is legal under the Convention Against Torture. So that's the first Bybee memo. And then secondly, what are the 10 techniques that can be applied to Abu Zubaydah? At the same time that this is happening, you see back and forth between the Office of Legal Counsel and the White House counsel and John Rizzo at the CIA, but also Bill Haynes at the DOD. So Bill Haynes, in his capacity general counsel of the DOD, is both writing back and forth to Guantanamo to say what techniques are allowed and what techniques are not. So there's a fascinating interaction between all of these attorneys. And I think one thing that sets this legal staff up from previous executive branch lawyers is that the individuals who are populating the Office of Legal Counsel at this time were individuals who had an outsized view of what the executive could do in wartime. Many of these individuals had served in a Watergate presidency. They believed that the president had been unduly sanctioned. And so many of them came into the executive branch with this view that in a time of war, the commander-in-chief had literally unrestrained power.
I would just add that one thing George Tenet and I often say, and by the way, George Tenet's a Georgetown graduate, was director during this period. We often say we hope that no future CIA leadership ever has to make these kinds of decisions again. Now, Bruce is suggesting maybe someone will.
Good. David, should we draw it to a close?
Yes. This is a normal 2.5-hour seminar for a Georgetown class. So but I think that this panel, I can sense that every intelligence class taught in the Security Studies program will probably make viewing this panel mandatory viewing. I think the gems that have come out of this are really, really important. So I'd like to thank all 4 members of our panel here for a truly outstanding presentation and discussion. So thank you very much.